Welcome back to 100 Popular Lore Stories of Resident Evil, a complete anthology of horror, mystery, and conspiracy. From the origins of evil to the legacy of survival. 1996-2025. Let's continue with ERA2, The Raccoon City Nightmare. The Fall of a City and the Death of Innocence, 1998. Introduction. The year 1998 would become known as the darkest chapter in American history that most Americans would never know about. In the span of a few months, an entire city would fall to biological horror, and the truth of what happened would be buried under layers of government secrecy and corporate cover-ups. These are the stories of those who lived through the nightmare, and those who did not. Story 11. The Outbreak in the Arklay Mountains. In May of 1998, the nightmare that had been brewing in Umbrella's laboratories finally escaped its containment. The exact cause of the outbreak remains debated. Some say it was an accident, a careless moment in the lab. Others whisper that it was sabotage, an act of revenge by forces unknown. But the truth is far stranger than either theory. Deep in the facility's lower levels, something had been growing for 10 years. The Queen Leech, still carrying the consciousness of the murdered James Marcus, had finally achieved enough power to act. It released T-virus into the facility's water supply, contaminating every researcher, every guard, every test subject who had the misfortune to drink from the compound's taps. The transformation was not immediate. At first, those infected merely felt unwell. Headaches, nausea, a persistent fever. They continued their work, thinking themselves afflicted with nothing more than a seasonal flu. By the time the first deaths occurred, by the time the dead rose from their makeshift morgue to feast on the living, it was far too late to contain the outbreak. The infected spread into the Arklay forest, driven by instincts they no longer understood. Wildlife that encountered them, dogs, crows, snakes, became carriers of the virus, undergoing their own horrifying transformations. Within weeks, the forest surrounding the Spencer mansion became a death trap, filled with creatures that defied natural law. Reports began filtering into the Raccoon City Police Department. Hikers had gone missing. Hunters had returned with stories of animals that attacked without fear, that seemed impervious to gunfire. Most disturbing were the reports of cannibalistic murders in the mountains. Victims found with their flesh torn away, their bodies partially consumed. The police were baffled. These were not the acts of any animal they recognized, nor did they match the profile of any serial killer in the FBI databases. Chief of Police Brian Irons, secretly on Umbrella's payroll, did his best to suppress the investigation, dismissing the reports as exaggerations or misidentifications. But the bodies kept appearing, and the public's fear continued to grow. The dead walked, and no one believed. Story 12. S.T.A.R.S, The Best and the Brightest. The Raccoon City Police Department had one unit equipped to handle extraordinary situations, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, known as S.T.A.R.S. This elite team had been established to deal with terrorism, hostage situations, and other crises beyond the capabilities of ordinary officers. Little did they know that they were about to face something beyond the imagination of any tactical manual. S.T.A.R.S was divided into two teams, Alpha and Bravo. Alpha team was led by Albert Wesker, the same Wesker who had assassinated James Marcus 10 years earlier, now serving undercover as a police captain while still reporting to Umbrella's shadowy inner circle. His mission was to monitor any investigations that might threaten the corporation's secrets. Among Alpha team's members were some of the finest officers in the department. Chris Redfield was a former Air Force pilot, skilled in combat and unwavering in his sense of justice. His partner and fellow marksman, Jill Valentine, was a former thief who had turned her talents toward law enforcement, her expertise in locks and security systems earning her the nickname, the Master of Unlocking. Barry Burton was a weapons specialist, a family man whose loyalty to his teammates was matched only by his knowledge of firearms. Bravo team, led by Captain Enrico Marini, was equally impressive. Rebecca Chambers was the team's medic, a prodigy who had graduated college at 18 and joined S.T.A.R.S shortly after. Kenneth Sullivan, Forrest Spire, Richard Aiken, and Edward Dewey rounded out the squad, each one trained, dedicated, and completely unprepared for what awaited them in the Arklay Mountains. On July 23, 1998, Bravo team was dispatched to investigate the cannibal murders. Their helicopter experienced engine trouble over the forest and was forced to make an emergency landing. As they explored the area, they discovered a wrecked military transport vehicle, an umbrella vehicle, though they did not know it at the time, and began to suspect that the situation was far more complex than a simple murder investigation. One by one, the members of Bravo team fell. Edward Dewey was attacked by zombie dogs before the team even reached the mansion, his dying words a warning that came too late. Kenneth Sullivan was ambushed while exploring the mansion's east wing, his head torn from his body by a creature that had once been human. Forrest Spire was found later, his body pecked apart by infected crows, grenades still strapped to his vest. Richard Aiken survived longer than most, fighting his way through the mansion until a giant snake, a creature called Yawn by the researchers who had created it, delivered a venomous bite that left him paralyzed. Rebecca Chambers found him and administered what treatment she could, but without proper anti-venom, his survival was measured in hours. By the time Alpha Team was sent to search for their missing colleagues the following night, Bravo Team had been all but annihilated. Enrico Marini alone had survived with his wits intact, and he had discovered something that would cost him his life: evidence of Wesker's true allegiance. Heroes were sent to die in darkness. Story 13. The Mansion Incident. A Night of Terror. Alpha Team's helicopter set down in a clearing near where Bravo Team's aircraft had been found. The pilot, Brad Vickers, remained with the aircraft while the team investigated on foot. Almost immediately, they were attacked by dogs unlike any they had seen, massive, skinless creatures whose speed and ferocity sent the team fleeing through the forest in a desperate bid for survival. Joseph Frost, one of Alpha Team's members, was overtaken by the pack. His screams echoed through the trees as his teammates ran, unable to save him. The survivors, Chris, Jill, Barry, and their captain Wesker, found themselves at the gates of a sprawling mansion, its Gothic architecture looming against the night sky like something from a nightmare. They entered seeking shelter, not knowing that they had stumbled into the heart of Umbrella's secrets. The Spencer Mansion, with all its puzzles and passages, had become a tomb. The researchers who had worked in the underground laboratory were now shambling horrors, driven by mindless hunger. Test subjects had escaped their containment, creating a menagerie of biological nightmares. What followed was a night that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Chris and Jill became separated almost immediately, each forced to navigate the mansion's deadly corridors alone. They encountered creatures that defied explanation, zombies that shambled through doorways, their rotting hands grasping for living flesh. Giant spiders that dropped from ceilings, their venom capable of paralyzing a grown man in seconds. Venomous snakes that had grown to monstrous proportions, their bodies thick as tree trunks. The mansion itself seemed designed to kill them. Every door required a key, and the keys were hidden behind puzzles that would have challenged a cryptographer. Crests had to be arranged in specific patterns. Paintings concealed hidden switches. Death masks had to be recovered from rooms filled with traps. It was as if the building itself was testing them, measuring their worth. They found Bravo Team's surviving members one by one. Richard Aiken succumbed to the snake venom despite Rebecca's efforts, his last act providing ammunition that would prove vital in battles to come. Kenneth Sullivan's body was discovered in the mansion's east wing, his severed head a testament to the violence that had claimed him. Rebecca Chambers alone survived relatively unscathed, though the horrors she had witnessed left marks that would never fully heal. Through journals and documents scattered throughout the mansion, the survivors pieced together the truth. They learned of Umbrella's experiments, of the T-virus and its effects, of the bioweapons developed in the underground laboratory. Each revelation was more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of corporate evil so vast that it seemed impossible to comprehend. And through it all, they were being watched. Wesker moved through the mansion like a ghost, manipulating events, ensuring that his teammates faced the maximum danger while he gathered the data Umbrella required. He was conducting an experiment of his own, testing how trained operatives performed against bioorganic weapons. His former colleagues were nothing more than test subjects. In the House of Horrors, truth was the greatest terror. Story 14. Wesker's Betrayal. As the night wore on and the S.T.A.R.S members fought for their lives, Albert Wesker moved through the mansion with purpose. His mission was not survival, it was data collection. Umbrella wanted to observe how trained operatives performed against their bioorganic weapons, and Wesker was there to ensure the experiment ran its course. But Wesker had plans of his own. He had long since grown tired of serving Spencer's vision, believing himself destined for greater things. Tonight, he would steal Umbrella's research data and defect to a rival organization that had promised him resources beyond imagining. All he needed was proof that Umbrella's weapons worked, proof written in the blood of his former teammates. Barry Burton presented a complication. Wesker had discovered that Barry's family was vulnerable, and he had used that leverage to turn the weapons specialist into an unwilling accomplice. Barry was forced to sabotage his teammates' efforts, to lead them into danger, to report on their progress, all while being torn apart by guilt. He loved his family, but he also loved his fellow S.T.A.R.S members. Wesker's manipulation exploited that love with surgical precision. The betrayal came to a head in the underground laboratory, in a chamber housing Umbrella's most ambitious creation, the Tyrant. This creature was the pinnacle of T-virus research, a humanoid bioweapon standing over 8 feet tall, its left arm ending in a massive claw capable of piercing steel. Unlike the shambling zombies above, the Tyrant retained motor function and could follow basic commands. Wesker revealed his true allegiance to the surviving S.T.A.R.S members, sneering at their naive trust in him. He activated the Tyrant, expecting it to slaughter his former colleagues while he made his escape with the research data. But the creature had other ideas. Perhaps it sensed weakness in its would-be master, or perhaps its programming simply malfunctioned. The Tyrant's claw pierced Wesker's chest, lifting him off the ground before discarding his body like refuse. Chris and Jill should have felt satisfaction at seeing the traitor fall, but there was no time for such emotions. The Tyrant turned its attention to them, and the fight for survival reached its most desperate moment. Through teamwork, ingenuity, and no small amount of luck, they managed to damage the creature enough to trigger the facility's self-destruct sequence. The escape was a race against time. The mansion began to collapse around them as they fought their way to the helipad on the roof. Brad Vickers, who had fled when the zombie dogs attacked, finally found his courage and returned with the helicopter. But the Tyrant was not finished. It burst through the helipad's surface, ready for one final confrontation. It was a rocket launcher, dropped by Brad from the helicopter, that ended the battle. The explosion consumed the Tyrant, and moments later, the entire mansion followed. The survivors lifted off just as the compound was consumed by fire, watching the evidence of Umbrella's crimes burn below them. As the mansion burned, and the helicopter carrying the survivors lifted into the dawn sky, none of them knew that Wesker's story was far from over. The virus sample he had injected into himself before the confrontation was already working, rewriting his cellular structure, preparing him for resurrection. In a morgue somewhere in Raccoon City, his heart would soon beat again. Some evils refuse to die. Story 15. The Conspiracy of Silence. In the aftermath of the mansion incident, the surviving S.T.A.R.S members attempted to expose Umbrella's crimes. They presented their evidence to Chief Irons, to the mayor, to anyone who would listen. They described the horrors they had witnessed, the bioweapons, the corporate conspiracy that had led to the deaths of their colleagues. No one believed them. Umbrella's influence ran too deep, their web of corruption too carefully woven. Chief Irons, who had been accepting bribes from Umbrella for years, dismissed the survivors' claims as trauma-induced delusions. The media, many of whom depended on Umbrella advertising revenue, treated the story as too outlandish to report. Even federal authorities showed little interest in investigating a company that employed thousands and contributed millions to political campaigns. The official story was simple. A gas leak had caused an explosion at an old mansion in the mountains, killing several police officers who had been investigating unrelated crimes in the area. The cannibal murders were attributed to a wild animal that had since been destroyed. Case closed. Nothing to see here. Chris Redfield refused to give up. He launched his own investigation, tracking Umbrella's connections across the globe. His search led him to Europe, to facilities and shell companies that hinted at the true scope of the corporation's operations. He tried to convince Jill to come with him, but she chose to stay in Raccoon City, believing that she could expose Umbrella from within. It was a decision that would nearly cost her life. Umbrella was not content to simply ignore the survivors. They posed too great a risk to the company's secrets. Plans were already in motion to silence them permanently, plans that would be accelerated when the real nightmare began. Barry Burton, racked with guilt over his forced betrayal, took his family and disappeared. He would spend years in hiding, trying to protect his wife and daughters from the consequences of his actions. Rebecca Chambers returned to civilian life, haunted by nightmares that no amount of therapy could dispel. Meanwhile, in a private morgue funded by Umbrella, Albert Wesker's body began to stir. The experimental virus he had injected had done its work, repairing the damage the tyrant had inflicted and transforming him into something more than human. When he rose from the slab, his eyes glowed with an inner light, and a smile crossed his face. The smile of a man who had seen the face of death and found it wanting. The survivors thought they had won. They had destroyed the mansion, killed the tyrant, exposed Wesker as a traitor. But they had merely delayed the inevitable. Umbrella was too big, too powerful, too deeply embedded in the fabric of society to be brought down by a few traumatized police officers. And beneath Raccoon City, in the depths of the Nest facility, William Birkin was putting the finishing touches on something far worse than the T-virus. The living lied, and the dead rose again. Story 16. William Birkin's Desperate Gamble. While the mansion incident was unfolding in the Arklay Mountains, William Birkin was deep in the Nest facility beneath Raccoon City, putting the finishing touches on his masterwork. The G-virus was complete, a pathogen unlike anything the world had ever seen. Where the T-virus created zombies through necrosis and reanimation, the G-virus transformed its hosts into something far more terrifying. Infected individuals would mutate continuously, growing stronger and more monstrous with each transformation. More disturbing still, G-virus carriers could reproduce asexually, implanting embryos in other living beings that would burst forth as new creatures. Birkin had named it the Golgotha virus, after the hill where Christ was crucified, a place of transformation and rebirth. He saw himself as a kind of Messiah, bringing a new form of life into the world. The fact that this new life was monstrous beyond comprehension did not trouble him. He was a scientist. Ethics were for lesser minds. Birkin saw the G-virus as his ticket to freedom. He had grown disillusioned with Umbrella, tired of seeing his genius credited to corporate executives who couldn't tell a petri dish from a dinner plate. He began secret negotiations with the United States military, offering to sell them the G-virus in exchange for protection and continued funding for his research. His wife, Annette, knew about the negotiations and supported them. She had seen what Umbrella was capable of, had watched as the corporation disposed of anyone who became inconvenient. She wanted her family, herself, William, and their daughter Sherry, to be free of Umbrella's shadow. The G-virus was their way out. But Umbrella had eyes everywhere. When they learned of Birkin's planned defection, they dispatched a team of operatives to recover the virus by force. The Umbrella Special Forces, an elite unit dressed in black tactical gear and trained to handle biological threats, descended on Nest with orders to secure the G-virus samples and eliminate any witnesses. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Birkin refused to surrender his life's work. When the soldiers cornered him in the laboratory, he resisted, and they opened fire. Bullets tore through his body, and he collapsed in a pool of his own blood, watching as the soldiers gathered his research and prepared to leave. But as consciousness faded, Birkin made one final, desperate decision. With the last of his strength, he reached for a syringe containing the G-virus and plunged it into his own body. If he could not live as a man, he would survive as a monster. The soldiers, believing their target dead, continued their extraction, unaware that they had just set in motion the destruction of an entire city. Genius chose horror over death. Story 17. The Sewer Rats and the Outbreak. The Umbrella soldiers thought their mission was complete. They had the G-virus samples, and Birkin was dead. They retreated through the sewers beneath Raccoon City, following a route that would take them to an extraction point outside the city limits. What they did not realize was that Birkin was far from finished. The G-virus worked with terrifying speed. Birkin's wounds closed, his body convulsed, and something new began to grow from within him. His right arm swelled to monstrous proportions, bones cracking and reshaping into something that was no longer human. His clothes tore as his body expanded, and where once there had been a brilliant scientist, now there was only hunger and rage. The creature that had been William Birkin pursued the soldiers through the sewers. One by one, he tore them apart, his mutated arm cleaving through body armor as if it were paper. Their screams echoed through the tunnels, a symphony of terror that no one above ground could hear. In the chaos of the slaughter, the case containing the T-virus samples was broken, its contents spilling into the sewer water. The rats found it first. Raccoon City's sewer system was home to thousands of the creatures, and they drank eagerly from the contaminated water. Within hours, the infected rats began to change, becoming more aggressive, more hungry, their bodies hosting the virus as it multiplied within them. Within days, they had spread the virus throughout the sewer network, contaminating the water supply that fed the entire city. No one noticed at first. People began feeling ill, calling in sick to work, visiting doctors who prescribed rest and fluids. The hospitals filled slowly, then rapidly, as the infection spread from person to person through bites, scratches, and shared contact with contaminated fluids. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. The first deaths were attributed to a flu outbreak. Then came the reports of violence, people attacking their neighbors, biting them, tearing at them with fingers that had become claws. Then the dead began to rise, and the city's thin veneer of civilization cracked and shattered. On September 22, 1998, the first confirmed zombie sighting was reported in Raccoon City. By September 28th, the city had fallen. 100,000 people, dead or transformed, shambling through streets that had once bustled with life. All because one broken vial spilled into the water. One broken vial drowned a city. Story 18. Leon S. Kennedy's first day. Leon Scott Kennedy was supposed to start his career with the Raccoon City Police Department on September 29, 1998. He had trained for years for this moment, graduating at the top of his class from the police academy, dreaming of making a difference in a city that he had heard was peaceful and prosperous. A night of heavy drinking to celebrate his new job caused him to oversleep, and he arrived in Raccoon City hours later than planned. It was a hangover that would save his life. By the time Leon drove into the city limits, the outbreak had already claimed the majority of the population. His first sign that something was wrong came at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The place seemed abandoned, but when Leon investigated, he found a zombie feeding on a corpse in the back room. His training kicked in, and he put down the creature with a shot to the head, but not before catching a glimpse of the horror that awaited him. The drive into the city proper was a journey through hell. Crashed cars lined the streets, their owners either dead or transformed into shuffling horrors. Fires burned unchecked in buildings, their glow casting dancing shadows across scenes of carnage. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, a miasma that seeped into the car even with the windows closed. Leon saw zombies everywhere, former citizens now reduced to mindless predators, reaching for his car as he drove past. He saw bodies in the streets, some moving, some still. He saw windows smashed, doors broken down, the evidence of a city that had fought back and lost. Near the center of town, Leon encountered a woman who would change his life forever. Claire Redfield had come to Raccoon City searching for her brother Chris, unaware that he had left weeks earlier to investigate Umbrella in Europe. She had arrived to find a nightmare, and she had been fighting for her life ever since. When zombies surrounded the diner where she had taken shelter, Leon was there to help. Their first meeting was punctuated by gunfire and screaming, by the crash of breaking glass, and the moans of the undead. But in that chaos, something clicked between them. A recognition of kindred spirits. Two people determined to survive against impossible odds. Together they fought their way through the undead horde, commandeering a police car and racing toward the only place that might offer safety: the Raccoon City Police Department. They believed they would find safety there, surrounded by trained officers with weapons and resources. They could not have been more wrong. Every survivor's story began with disbelief. Story 19. The RPD, a monument to failure. The Raccoon City Police Department should have been the city's last bastion of defense. Its officers were trained professionals, its armory well-stocked, its building designed with security in mind. The RPD had been built in a converted art museum, its grand halls and high ceilings a testament to the city's cultural aspirations. But when the outbreak began, the RPD fell as quickly as any other part of the city. The officers fought bravely at first, establishing barricades, evacuating civilians, trying to maintain order in a world that had lost all sense of it. But the zombies kept coming, wave after wave, and one by one, the defenders fell. Chief Brian Irons was responsible for much of the chaos. When Umbrella's secret was threatened by the outbreak, Irons received orders to ensure that no evidence of the company's involvement survived. He locked down the building, trapping officers inside with the growing horde of zombies. He scattered the keys that would allow escape, hiding them throughout the building in locations only he knew. He murdered anyone who tried to flee, anyone who might carry word of Umbrella's crimes to the outside world. Irons had always been unstable, a man with dark appetites that Umbrella had been happy to indulge in exchange for his cooperation. Now, with the city falling around him, his madness blossomed into something truly monstrous. He stalked the halls of the RPD, hunting survivors, adding to his collection of trophies that he kept in his private quarters. By the time Leon and Claire arrived, the RPD was a charnel house. The hallways were littered with bodies. Some had risen as zombies, others lay where they had fallen, too damaged even for the virus to reanimate. Blood painted the marble floors, and the moans of the undead echoed through corridors that had once rung with the footsteps of public servants. In the chaos, Leon and Claire became separated. A truck crashed through the gates, forcing them to take different routes through the building. Each was forced to navigate the building's nightmare maze alone, finding fellow survivors and losing them with equal frequency. They encountered things that defied explanation. Lickers, skinless creatures that clung to walls and ceilings, their exposed brains pulsing, their tongues capable of piercing a human skull. The hulking form of Chief Irons as he dragged his victims into the sewers. And something else, a massive figure in a coat that seemed to be tracking them through the building, its footsteps echoing like doom. This was the tyrant, known as Mr. X, deployed by Umbrella to recover the G-Virus and eliminate any witnesses. It moved through the RPD with unstoppable purpose, shrugging off gunfire that would kill any normal creature. Wherever Leon and Claire went, the sound of its heavy footsteps followed, a constant reminder that escape might be impossible. In the halls of law, only chaos remained. Story 20. Ada Wong, the Woman in Red. In the midst of the Raccoon City nightmare, Leon encountered a woman who was nothing like the terrified survivors he had been finding. She moved with purpose and confidence, her red dress somehow pristine despite the carnage around her. She said her name was Ada Wong, and she claimed to be searching for her boyfriend, a researcher named John who worked for Umbrella. It was a lie, of course, the first of many that Ada would tell. She was a corporate spy, sent by a mysterious organization to recover a sample of the G-Virus from the Nest facility. Her employers wanted to level the playing field, to ensure that Umbrella's rivals had access to the same biological weapons that the corporation had been developing in secret. Ada had been trained for missions like this, trained to manipulate, to deceive, to use whatever tools were available to achieve her objectives. Leon Kennedy, with his earnest idealism and his determination to protect everyone he encountered, should have been just another tool. A useful distraction. A means to an end. But something unexpected happened as Ada and Leon fought their way through the city together. She found herself drawn to the young officer, moved by his idealism and his refusal to abandon anyone to the hordes of undead. He reminded her of the person she might have been, once, before the life of a spy had stripped away her capacity for genuine connection. Their partnership was tested at every turn. Ada was wounded by the mutated Birkin, his massive claw tearing through her side as she pushed Leon out of the way. It should have been a fatal wound, but Ada was nothing if not resilient. Leon carried her through the sewers, refusing to leave her behind even when it would have been the pragmatic choice. When they reached Nest and the truth of Ada's mission became clear, Leon was devastated. He had trusted her, had risked his life for her, and it had all been based on lies. But even knowing what she was, he couldn't bring himself to see her as an enemy. There was something in her eyes, something that suggested the lies hurt her as much as they hurt him. In the final confrontation, Ada appeared to fall to her death, plunging into the depths of the facility as Birkin's monstrous form raged above. Leon had no time to grieve. He had to escape before the facility's self-destruct sequence reduced everything to atoms. He didn't see Ada's grappling hook catch a railing, didn't know that she had survived and secured a tissue sample from Birkin's remains. Their paths would cross again in the years to come. Ada would continue her work as a spy, serving mysterious masters and pursuing agendas that defied easy categorization. But she would never forget the earnest young cop who had treated her with kindness in a city of nightmares. And somehow, she would always find a way to help him, even when it conflicted with her orders. In darkness, unexpected bonds were forged. Story 21. The Birkin Family Tragedy. Annette Birkin had known what her husband was working on. She had helped him, in fact, managing the Nest facility, while William focused on his research. She had told herself that it was for the greater good, that the viruses they created would benefit humanity, someday. The lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night. When the outbreak began, Annette's first thought was for her daughter. Sherry was 12 years old, a bright and curious child who had learned not to ask too many questions about her parents' work. Annette had arranged for Sherry to be brought to the police station, hoping that the officers there could protect her until the crisis passed. But Chief Irons had other plans. He saw Sherry as leverage, a way to control the Birkins if they survived the outbreak, or perhaps as another addition to his collection of victims. He had Sherry brought to the orphanage attached to the police station, keeping her trapped while the city burned around her. Claire Redfield found Sherry in that orphanage, frightened and alone. The young woman who had come to Raccoon City, looking for her brother, now found herself protecting a child who had no one else. Together, they navigated the nightmare of the RPD, evading Irons and the creatures that stalked the building's halls. But Sherry's father had not forgotten her. The thing that had been William Birkin tracked his daughter through the city, driven by some fragmentary memory of paternal instinct, or perhaps by a darker urge. When he caught up with Sherry, he didn't kill her. Instead, he did something worse. He implanted a G-embryo within her, seeking to reproduce as the virus demanded. Claire watched helplessly as Sherry fell ill, as something grew within her that would soon burst forth in a parody of birth. The child's skin grew pale, her fever spiked, and she spoke of feeling something moving inside her. Time was running out, and Claire had no idea how to save her. It was Annette, dying from wounds inflicted by her transformed husband, who provided the means to save her daughter. She found Claire in the depths of Nest, her life bleeding out onto the sterile floor. With her last breath, she gave Claire the formula for a vaccine that could neutralize the embryo before it matured. "Save my daughter," she whispered. "Please." In the depths of Nest, as the facility crumbled around them, Claire administered the vaccine to Sherry. The child survived, though traces of the G virus would remain in her blood for life. Traces that would make her valuable, make her a target, make her a prisoner of the government that claimed to be protecting her. But she survived. In a city of the dead, survival was the only victory that mattered. Love persisted, even at the end. Story 22. Jill Valentine and the Last Escape. Jill Valentine had stayed in Raccoon City when Chris left for Europe, convinced that she could expose Umbrella's crimes from within the system. When the outbreak began, she was prepared, more than most anyway. She had seen the horror of the mansion, had fought the creatures that Umbrella created, and she knew what she was facing. On September 28th, the same night that Leon and Claire were fighting through the RPD, Jill began her own desperate escape from the city. The streets were worse than the mansion had ever been. There was no laboratory here to contain the infection, no walls to slow its spread. The virus had claimed the entire population, and Jill was alone in a city of the dead. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, using skills honed by years of training and months of nightmares. She found weapons where she could, crafted ammunition from components scattered throughout the city, and put down every zombie that stood between her and freedom. But for every one she killed, 10 more seemed to take its place. But she was not alone for long. Umbrella had anticipated that survivors of the mansion incident might pose a threat, and they had deployed their most advanced weapon to eliminate them, Nemesis. This was the culmination of the Nemesis project, a tyrant-class bioweapon implanted with a parasite that granted it intelligence, persistence, and an unsettling ability to speak. S.T.A.R.S, the word echoed through the burning streets, a death sentence spoken in a rasping voice that no human throat could produce. Nemesis had been programmed with the faces and names of every S.T.A.R.S member, and it would not stop until they were all dead. It crashed through walls to reach her. It shrugged off wounds that would have destroyed any lesser creature. It followed her through fire and flood, through buildings and sewers, never stopping, never resting, never giving up. Jill's escape became a running battle, a desperate flight through burning buildings and zombie-clogged streets, with the unstoppable Nemesis always a step behind. She found allies along the way. Carlos Oliveira, a member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service sent to evacuate survivors, and his fellow mercenaries Mikhail Victor and Nikolai Genevieve. But the UBCS mission was a facade. They had been sent not to save the city's population, but to collect combat data on Umbrella's bioweapons. Nikolai, in particular, was a supervisor, a spy tasked with gathering information and eliminating any witnesses who might threaten the corporation's secrets. When his true allegiance became clear, Jill found herself fighting enemies both living and dead. Survival became her only mission. Story 23. Nemesis, the pursuer that never sleeps. Of all the nightmares that Umbrella Corporation created, perhaps none has haunted the dreams of survivors quite like Nemesis. It was the ultimate evolution of the tyrant concept. Not just a weapon, but a hunter, capable of following orders, adapting to circumstances, and pursuing its targets with relentless determination. The creature's origins lay in Umbrella's European branch, where researchers had been experimenting with parasitic organisms that could control host bodies. The Nemesis alpha parasite, derived, ironically, from samples of Los Ploggers that had been smuggled out of Spain decades earlier, when implanted in a T-103 tyrant, created a symbiotic relationship that enhanced both entities. The tyrant gained intelligence and the ability to use weapons. It could operate firearms, deploy rocket launchers, and improvise tactics based on the behavior of its targets. The parasite gained a nearly indestructible body to inhabit, one that could regenerate from almost any wound given enough time and biomass. Nemesis was deployed with a single mission: eliminate all surviving members of S.T.A.R.S. Its programming included facial recognition data, tactical protocols, and, most disturbing of all, the capacity to learn from its encounters. Each time Jill escaped, Nemesis adapted. It found new routes, anticipated her strategies, and grew stronger with each battle. The creature's appearance was designed to inspire terror. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, wrapped in a leather coat, that could not hide its deformed musculature. It moved with a speed that belied its size. Tentacles writhed beneath its skin, occasionally bursting forth to attack from unexpected angles or to infect victims with the parasite's spawn. Its face was a ruin of exposed muscle and stitched flesh, but its eyes, when they found their target, burned with unmistakable purpose. Throughout that final night in Raccoon City, Nemesis and Jill played their deadly game of cat and mouse. It crashed through walls to reach her, survived explosions that should have reduced it to atoms, and spoke her team's name like a prayer of death. Each encounter left Jill more exhausted, more wounded, more certain that escape was impossible. But Jill Valentine had survived the Spencer mansion. She had faced horrors that would break lesser minds. And she refused to let Umbrella's monster be the end of her story. In the bowels of a waste treatment plant, as the clock ticked toward the city's destruction, she finally destroyed Nemesis, or at least rendered it incapable of pursuit. Its burning remains sank into the toxic sludge, and for the first time in hours, the night fell silent. Carlos found her there, battered but alive. Together, they made their way to the extraction point, escaping the city moments before its destruction. Behind them, Nemesis's regenerating body was consumed by nuclear fire, finally ending its hunt. But the memory of that rasping voice, that single word repeated like a curse, would follow Jill Valentine for the rest of her life. Even nightmares can be killed. Story 24. The Cleansing Fire, Raccoon City's End. On October 1st, 1998, the United States government made a decision that would be debated for decades. Raccoon City could not be saved. The infection had spread too far, claimed too many victims, and the risk of it escaping to neighboring communities was too great. There was only one option left: complete sterilization. The decision was not made lightly. Military commanders argued over alternatives: quarantine, targeted strikes, biological countermeasures. Politicians worried about the optics of destroying an American city. Intelligence agencies scrambled to understand what had happened and who was responsible. But in the end, the conclusion was unanimous: Raccoon City had to die. At dawn, a thermobaric missile struck the city center. The explosion consumed everything: buildings, vehicles, and the 100,000 souls who had called Raccoon City home. Zombies were incinerated where they stood, their rotting flesh vaporized in an instant. The Nest facility was buried under tons of rubble. The Spencer mansion, already destroyed, was erased even from the landscape. The survivors watched from varying distances, each carrying their own burden of guilt and grief. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield escaped on a train, emerging from a tunnel seconds before the shockwave would have claimed them. They emerged into a sunrise made bloody by the mushroom cloud rising behind them, two survivors of an apocalypse that had consumed an entire city. Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira were extracted by helicopter, watching from the air as the city was consumed by fire. Jill had been infected by Nemesis during their final battle, and Carlos had found an experimental vaccine in a hospital overrun by zombies. She would survive, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. Sherry Birkin, still recovering from her near transformation, was taken into government custody. The G-virus in her blood made her too valuable to release, and she would spend the next 15 years as a protected asset, studied, monitored, and never truly free. Claire promised to find her, to help her, but the government had other plans. And somewhere in the chaos, Ada Wong slipped away with a tissue sample that contained fragments of the G-virus. She delivered it to her employers, never knowing, or perhaps not caring, how many deaths her prize would eventually cause. The sample would change hands multiple times over the following years, each transfer spawning new nightmares. Raccoon City was gone, but the horrors it had spawned were only beginning to spread. The survivors would carry the infection of knowledge into a world that was not prepared for what was coming. And in boardrooms and laboratories around the globe, men and women looked at the smoking crater where a city had once stood and saw only opportunity. In ash and memory, a new era began. Story 25. The Outbreak Files, Stories of the Forgotten. History remembers the heroes: Leon, Claire, Jill, Chris. But there were others in Raccoon City that night. Ordinary people whose stories of survival have been largely forgotten. They were waitresses and plumbers, doctors and journalists, security guards and students. They had no special training, no advanced weapons, no knowledge of what they were facing. And yet some of them survived. Kevin Ryman was an RPD officer who had failed the S.T.A.R.S entrance exam twice. He had been drinking at Jay's bar when the outbreak began, drowning his sorrows in whiskey and self-pity. When zombies crashed through the windows, he discovered that he had more courage than he had ever believed. He led a group of survivors through the city's underground, using knowledge of the streets that only a beat cop could possess. Mark Wilkins was a security guard at a local bank, a Vietnam veteran whose combat experience had left him with scars both visible and hidden. When the dead rose, he fell back on training that was decades old, organizing defenses and leading counterattacks. He found purpose in protecting others, a reason to live that had eluded him since his return from the war. Alyssa Ashcroft was a journalist who had been investigating Umbrella for months, following leads that her editors dismissed as conspiracy theories. The outbreak validated her worst fears, and nearly killed her in the process. She escaped with evidence that would eventually help bring the corporation down, though she would not live to see Umbrella's fall. Her daughter, Grace, would one day return to uncover the truth that had cost her mother everything. Jim Chapman was a Subway employee, a nervous young man who had never fired a gun in his life. He survived through luck, through quick thinking, and through a stubborn refusal to give up. He discovered reserves of courage he had never known he possessed, leading survivors through the subway tunnels he knew better than anyone. David King was a plumber who knew the city's infrastructure, its pipes, its tunnels, its forgotten passages, better than the engineers who had built them. He used that knowledge to find escape routes that others missed, to bypass barricades and avoid hordes. He said little, but his actions spoke volumes. Yoko Suzuki was an Umbrella employee who had lost her memories of her time with the company. The outbreak triggered flashbacks that revealed her role in the corporation's crimes and her desperate attempts to make amends. She guided survivors through Umbrella facilities, using access codes that her conscious mind had forgotten. George Hamilton was a doctor at Raccoon General Hospital, a man who had sworn an oath to do no harm. He spent the outbreak treating the wounded and searching for any cure that might turn the tide. He could not save the city, but he saved dozens of individual lives, each one a small victory against the overwhelming darkness. And Cindy Lennox was a waitress at Jay's bar, a young woman whose kindness and determination became a beacon of hope in the nightmare. She organized survivors, maintained morale, and refused to give up even when all seemed lost. She represented the best of humanity in the worst of circumstances. These 8 individuals, and countless others like them, navigated the same nightmare that claimed the city's population. They fought through the hospital where the virus had first been studied, through the police station where their neighbors had been massacred, through the university where Umbrella's secrets had been partially revealed. They escaped through subway tunnels, fought off hunters in the streets, and witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Most of them survived. Some found peace in anonymity, building new lives far from the ashes of their old ones. Others could not escape the gravity of what they had experienced, drawn back again and again to the mysteries that Umbrella had left behind. Their stories may be forgotten by history, but they deserve to be remembered. Ordinary people who became heroes in the face of extraordinary evil. Every survivor carried a story worth telling. And that brings us to the end of ERA2. The Raccoon City Nightmare claimed over 100,000 lives in a single night. It exposed the depths of corporate evil and government complicity. It created heroes and villains whose conflicts would shape the next 2 decades of global history. But it was only the beginning. Umbrella's viruses had escaped into the world, and the knowledge of how to create them could not be unlearned. New threats were already emerging, in the Antarctic, in Spain, in Africa, in Eastern Europe. The survivors of Raccoon City would face them all. In Era 3, we follow Chris and Claire Redfield to the Antarctic, where the twisted Ashford twins await. We witness the fall of Umbrella, and the rise of new enemies. We learn that some evils cannot be killed, only postponed. Continue to Era 3, The Ashford Legacy. Follow along for ERA 3, The Ashford Legacy. Madness in the Antarctic and Rockford Island.